Okay, I think we're live. Hi, everybody. I'm Donald Robertson once again, as you know, and I'm saying again hello once again from here in Nova Scotia in Canada, with Mickey Dog. Give me a funny look, somewhere over there in the background. Um, If you all want to have a look at the live chat area on the right hand side of your screen and just briefly say hi and say where you're from and just confirm that you can hear me okay, the sound's okay, presumably you can see me okay, and I will just check in there briefly. I see a few more people arriving. And then once I've just checked that you're able to hear me okay and you're responding, I'll begin with some basic agenda setting. Still waiting for a response. Okay, well, I can see more people arriving, so maybe just give a minute or two for the stragglers to get here. If you're just arriving, if you could just say hi and introduce yourself and say where you're from in the live chat area on the right hand side, and then once I've got a couple of responses appearing, hey, hi everybody. Cool, audio and video are okay, we are good to go. Okay, so I've got coffee, I've got audio and video, I've got Mickey Dog, I've got everything that I need. So welcome to week 2 of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, and the agenda today, as every Sunday, is going to be basically a similar format. So I'm going to start off with some basic housekeeping, and then I'm going to review the questions, comments in the discussion area from week 1. Then I'm going to do a bit of a preview of week 2, what it's about, to kick that off and prepare you for it. And then I am going to have a look in the live chat area, and if there are any questions in there, there's usually a couple, I'm going to take some time to respond to those. So let's start off with the housekeeping. Today, I think last week it took an hour. It kind of depends how many questions there are. I've got a feeling it is going to take maybe an hour today, so some of you might watch the whole thing, or others might just watch part of it and then come back and watch the rest later. There's going to be a recording of it. I'll try and be as brief as I can, but I guess we've got a bunch of things to cover. There's quite a lot of discussion that I noticed, so I'm going to comment on some of the things that people have mentioned. There's a delay of about 30 seconds between me saying something and you seeing it, so that introduces a delay in me responding to the live chat. The live chat's temporary. It disappears at the end of the live session, and then there'll be a permanent recording on YouTube that you can go back and watch anytime, and there'll be a permanent comments area, so you can post comments there afterwards. As there's often some discussion in the live chat area between participants, if I look at it very briefly, it can be hard for me to spot questions. So what I'd ask is that you put an @ sign in Donald. Put @ Donald any questions that you want to address to me directly, and then when I'm kind of skimming through it during the session, it's easier for me to spot questions that you actually want me to answer. During the session I'll check in briefly and have a look at the chat, but mainly I'm going to answer questions at the end. So I'll just check in briefly and then we'll do our review of week 1. I think that's all housekeeping stuff. Hello from Helsinki and Romania and New York City, Illinois, Sacramento, New Mexico. No Canadians yet? Okay. We've got quite a variety of different locations that are checking in already. That's good. Okay, so we're starting off with a look at some of the things that came up in the week 1 discussion. There are a couple of different areas that you could comment on. Every week there's going to be an excerpt that you can talk about, and for week 1, last week, it was an excerpt about Antoninus Pius. And so I'm going to pull out a couple of things that people said, but also just generally responding to some of the comments. I read all of the comments, by the way, and I'll try and respond to most of them as well if I think that there's something that I can contribute. So Steve said, I can see why Marcus admires him. And a couple of people said kind of similar things, and maybe, is Marcus biased? Is it propaganda? Is he exaggerating? We can't know for sure. There's a sense in which Marcus is obviously biased because this is his greatest ally and the man that made him emperor ultimately, although it seems it was originally Hadrian's idea. However, in the histories, Antoninus is generally, I think, universally portrayed in a very positive light. His reign is fairly peaceful. I'm just going to read out what the Historia Augusta says, incidentally. I think I've added this quote to the section today because I thought it might help. The Augustan history says, in personal appearance he was strikingly handsome. I think that's fair. From the statues of him, seems like a reasonable description. In natural talent, brilliant. In temperament, kindly. He was aristocratic in countenance and calm in nature. So he was a kind, calm man. That's how Marcus describes him. A singularly gifted speaker and an elegant scholar. Conspicuously thrifty, a conscientious landholder, gentle, generous, and mindful of others' rights. He possessed all these qualities, moreover, in the proper mean and without ostentation, and in fine was praiseworthy in every way. So again, it could be propaganda, and it seems consistent with what Marcus and other sources say about Antoninus, though. Just a couple of little comments about it. Marcus had personal contact with 4 other Roman emperors. How is that possible? Well, in their capacity as emperor. So he knew Hadrian. It was Hadrian that selected Marcus to succeed him after Antoninus, because Marcus was too young when Hadrian died to take the throne. So Marcus knew Hadrian very well. He knew Antoninus. He also, the beginning, as we'll see in Marcus's reign, he ruled for the first time. There were 2 emperors. So he ruled alongside Lucius Verus. And so he saw Lucius as emperor, albeit a kind of slightly watered down emperor. And also in the last 3 years of his life, Marcus ruled alongside Commodus. Some people kind of mistakenly say that Commodus succeeded Marcus as emperor after he died. Actually, their reigns overlap because Marcus appointed Commodus co-emperor 3 years before he died. So he saw 4 other people functioning in their capacity as emperor. It's interesting if you bear that in mind when you're looking at the description of Antoninus Pius. And we can kind of exclude Commodus because the Meditations was probably written before Commodus was made co-emperor. But Marcus says nothing about Hadrian, so he's kind of notable by his complete omission. Antoninus is a glowing role model. He has a lot to say about him. He has nothing to say about Hadrian. The expression, if you've got nothing good to say, then don't say anything at all. One gets the impression that Marcus didn't really admire Hadrian. He actually mentions him later in the Meditations in passing, but he has nothing to say about his virtues as emperor. And he only has about a sentence or 2 to say about Lucius Verus, his co-emperor, and they're very kind of equivocal as well. He stimulated Marcus to improve his own character. What does that mean? Like by setting a bad example or in some kind of constructive way? It's very ambiguous, and he doesn't really say very much about him compared to what he says about Antoninus. So it's kind of interesting to look at it that way. Melissa said, I'm actually inspired to think of those with whom I'm closest and to wonder, could I write such an observation? Greg Lopez said it's hard to find a perfect role model, but selectively focusing on the best characteristics of others is useful. I mean, again, we can see Marcus is doing that. Antoninus seems very glowing. He must be being selective in some ways. But then Marcus talks about 16 people in Book 1 of the Meditations, and even Lucius Verus, who was even generously put, was a kind of mixed bag as emperor. Marcus tries to find something positive that he can say about him. You get the impression that he's trying more with some people than others. For example, the other person he doesn't mention is Herodes Atticus, who was his main Greek tutor, and we saw a bit about him. It's interesting he's left out completely. But also Fronto, Marcus's Latin tutor, he doesn't have very much to say about him, even though he was one of his closest friends from early childhood, from adolescence, played an important role in his life, maybe before that. But he doesn't say a lot about Fronto. It's like he's kind of scraping the barrel a little bit to find compliments. Also, one of his tutors, who was a Stoic, Cinna Catullus, we don't know how well Marcus knew this guy, we don't know anything else about him, but he doesn't have a huge amount to say about him. He makes one or two positive comments, and that's about it. Nothing compared to what he has to say about his other Stoic tutors. Ronald said Marcus does seem to idealise Antoninus Pius as a kind of Stoic sage. There's an interesting question there about how Stoic was Antoninus. There's no indication that he thought of himself as a philosopher. He almost certainly knew philosophers and had a positive attitude towards them. He certainly was happy for these Stoics to become Marcus's tutors. He must have approved of that. He certainly knew people like Junius Rusticus and Apollonius of Chalcedon. He criticised actually some of them a bit, but Marcus also mentions that he had a high regard for genuine philosophers. So one gets the impression that Pius was perhaps a guy who knew about things like Stoicism, but didn't really identify with Stoicism, and maybe had some of these virtues naturally, as it were. Marcus nevertheless thinks that he's an appropriate role model. You almost get the feeling that Marcus feels that he needs to train himself to acquire some of the virtues that Antoninus Pius had by nature. Or at least it kind of comes across a little bit like that sometimes. Antony mentions something interesting about the contrast between the well-known vices of notorious preceding emperors, like Caligula and Nero and Domitian. When you read the section about Antoninus Pius, you could be thinking, is Marcus contrasting this? He mentions Julius Caesar and Nero as tyrants later in the Meditations, so it does seem at the back of his mind he has this idea of how Antoninus contrasts with other emperors. But there's another more obvious contrast actually, which is implicit, I think, between Antoninus and once again Hadrian. So Marcus saw Hadrian as emperor. He was very familiar with him, and Antoninus Pius and Hadrian seem like very, very different characters. And you could go through the list of Antoninus's virtues and wonder how many of them are actually the opposite of characteristics that Hadrian exhibited, and maybe also to some extent with Lucius Verus. I kind of did that earlier actually. I was looking at the description of Antoninus and wondering, like, how many of these are kind of the opposite of Lucius Verus, things that we're told about him, and I noticed quite a lot of them. Maybe the majority of the things he mentioned were potentially things that really contrast with his adoptive brother, who also succeeded Antoninus as emperor. Anti-Uito, I hope I pronounced that correctly, mentions the qualities of Antoninus included kindness, loyalty, generosity, and forgiveness. I think Marcus would have seen those as Stoic virtues, subordinate to the four cardinal virtues if he thought about virtue using that schema. He didn't necessarily view it that way. He mentions the cardinal virtues. Certainly kindness is the name of one of the virtues, the subordinate virtues that's mentioned. Marcus talks about it a lot. And similar maybe to beneficence, which Marcus built a temple to. And so Marcus, I think, wanted beneficence to be something that was emblematic of his reign, in the way that equanimity appears to have been a word that was emblematic of Antoninus Pius's reign. So a little bit about that excerpt. I guess the meat of last week was the anger management technique, so I want to dig into that a little bit. I think a couple of people mentioned that Marcus talks about how anger is perceived as being manly, like being a tough guy or whatever, but he argues that kindness is more manly. It requires a greater strength of character and so on. Now, I think it's an interesting way of putting it. Certainly, Marcus sees anger or aggression as a kind of weakness, and that makes me think of is the character of Avidius Cassius, who we'll come to later, who was a very angry, aggressive, violent, cruel, tyrannical general who became so powerful that he was virtually an emperor in the eastern provinces, and then was acclaimed emperor, triggering a civil war with Marcus. But Cassius was notorious for being this kind of draconian general. He did incredibly brutal things to the men under his command to instill discipline in them. And even by this time in history, a lot of the people during Marcus's lifetime would have thought that was admirable. A lot of Romans would have considered the things he did normal, even though they seem incredibly brutal to us today. He did things like he would get deserters and shatter their hips and leave them crippled, wandering around the army camp as a deterrent to other soldiers doing the same thing. He used to kill people by chaining them together in groups of 10 and throwing them into rivers over the side of boats and stuff like that. There's all sorts of horrendous stories about things that Avidius Cassius did. But people would have seen him as a tough guy, like as angry, as aggressive, as violent, and showing strength of character. And Marcus completely contrasts with this. Actually, we'll see later how that played out in the long run, because arguably Marcus actually commanded more loyalty as a result of showing kindness and forgiveness to people. But the point I wanted to make is that there's some implication that Cassius criticised Marcus for being a weak leader, partly on this kind of basis that he was lenient in applying the law. He would exile people rather than executing them, and many Romans would have jumped on that as a sign of weakness, I think. Avidius being an example. Greg Lopez says the main con, maybe in the anger management stuff, would be the lack of emphasis on our techniques for catching early warning signs. So I want to dig deeper into the practical stuff and say a little bit about that. The Stoics discuss the symptoms of anger, particularly in Seneca's On Anger, like how it changes our facial expression, how it contorts our bodies and stuff. And I think that's similar to what we call psychoeducation in cognitive therapy. So talking to the client about typical symptoms of a problem is one way of making them more self-conscious and more likely to spot early warning signs. I keep talking about facial expression because in my experience that's the most powerful one to mention to people. Like, for some reason when people start visualizing their faces, they usually don't notice. But one of the first signs that someone's getting angry or frightened or exhibiting emotion is in their eyes, in their face. But we're kind of oblivious to it. But beginning to ask ourselves what happens to our face, what happens to our voice as well, tends to increase self-consciousness and can interrupt, de-automatize these kind of habitual ways of responding. So the Stoics, when they talk about the symptoms of anger, how it changes our facial expression, our voice, the look in our eyes and stuff, maybe you can be seen as doing something a little bit similar, sensitizing us to notice these things happening in ourselves. The role of the mentor, obviously, I don't want to labour this too much because we don't have these kind of live-in Stoic mentors, but that must have made a huge difference in terms of catching the early warning signs. So we kind of have to find substitutes today for that. Even in cognitive therapy, the therapist doesn't fulfill that role because they're not wandering around observing you all day. They see you for an hour a week, 50 minutes a week, and the client has to self-monitor between the sessions. So training the client or training ourselves in mindfulness practices like the body scan technique, for example, can help raise awareness of early warning signs of anger or anxiety, as we'll see. Questioning ourselves about different categories of symptoms. So asking yourself these penetrating questions about what the signs are, coming back to it repetitively, writing down notes. For example, in a thought form or a self-monitoring record. Like when you notice you're getting angry, just take pausing and writing down some brief notes on any early warning signs. When I work with clients in therapy, often I'd give them many different types of forms, but one self-monitoring form would have a column for early warning signs. And at the beginning of the session, I'd ask the clients, what new early warning signs have you spotted this week? And we keep kind of pushing that further and further. Another thing that helps is dividing early warning signs into different categories. So you can often increase awareness by dividing something or analysing it into components. And the simplest way we do that in cognitive therapy is by dividing anger or worry or anxiety into thoughts, actions and feelings. And actions could be further divided into maybe even internal, external actions, visible actions, body language, speech, tone of voice, stuff like that, facial expression. Feelings could be divided into different aspects of the emotion, emotions that are directed towards different things, how you feel about yourself, how you feel about other people, how you feel about different aspects of the situation. Physical sensations, physiological sensations like heart beating and stuff, and also thoughts, which could include mental images, things that you actually say to yourself, memories, fleeting thoughts, underlying attitudes or beliefs or judgments that you're aware of in the situation. So these are just all ways that we can carve up our response, our reaction in a situation, and carving it up. So in CBT we divide again a thought form into columns for maybe thoughts, actions and feelings, and break it down in this way, and that can help us by analysing our response into components to spot it earlier, basically. So I wanted to kind of conclude, but a sort of bridge between talking about week 1 and week 2 by talking in a little bit more depth about cognitive distancing, because we touched on it in week 1. It's important also to week 2. Week 2 is about my favourite subject, anxiety. That was my specialism as a therapist. It's an area of special interest to me, and so I'm kind of quite excited to talk about it. But cognitive distancing is one of the main techniques. I've got a list here of 16 different strategies, so I want to kind of delve into that a little bit further, because sometimes people say, well, how do you do this thing? How do you get this knack? I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. So the webinar is my opportunity to kind of ramble about bit practical stuff that people keep asking me about, and just kind of really talk about it in the way that I might talk in a workshop or with clients in therapy, and give some examples and little hints and tips and stuff like that. So I'll get to that in a moment. Before I do, I just want to check in very briefly with the chat, which is kind of going crazy. Okay. And once again, if you've just arrived late, if you have any questions for me, I'll have a look at those at the end. Put @Donald in front, and I'll spot those more easily if you do that. Someone from Belfast. Oh, good. Someone from Canada. I'm not alone. Cool. Got a couple of people from Canada. Right. Righto. So let's talk about cognitive distancing. What is it, and how do we get some? So when cognitive therapy originated, the emphasis was on asking what's the evidence for that, for our thoughts. So cognitive therapy is based on the cognitive theory of emotions, which basically says that our emotions, to a large extent, are the result of holding certain beliefs, very simply. And this is a concept that was inherited from Stoicism, funnily enough. So Beck, for instance, forwarded the cognitive model of anxiety that said it consists in the belief something bad is going to happen and I won't be able to cope with it, put very simply. And there's lots of different ways of kind of analysing that. It's not something necessarily you explicitly say, but it may be an underlying, a tacit or an unspoken belief that you have. And so Beck's claim was that when people feel anxious, it's basically because they believe that something bad is going to happen and that they're not going to be able to cope with it. That's called the transactional model of stress or anxiety. And there are more complex cognitive models, but that's the kind of gist of it. It's very similar to the Stoic model of fear. It's also the idea that the Stoics had. The passion of fear is based on the belief that something bad is going to happen. And so Beck said, well, cognitive therapy consists in asking, where's the evidence that something bad is going to happen? Where's the evidence that you're not going to be able to cope? And kind of encouraging the client to, through Socratic questioning, to weigh that up and reevaluate their underlying thinking. So, in order to do that, we have to first of all identify what the underlying belief is, and then we have to be willing to treat it as a hypothesis. So we have to be willing to take a step back from something that we're completely immersed in, that's very emotional, and treat it as if it could potentially be true or false. Treat it as a hypothesis. And that requires a bit of a mind shift. That's one of the first challenges that clients have to master in cognitive therapy right at the very beginning. They have to learn this knack of, being willing to question their own thinking about, sensitive, emotional things that are deeply ingrained and so on. Some people find it very hard to do that. Some people find it easy to do that. So Beck called this cognitive distancing, and he talked about a bunch of ways in which this initial distancing could be achieved, treating our beliefs as hypotheses rather than facts, separating them, peeling them off of reality a little bit. So rather than me just thinking, that guy's a bastard, like, I'd think, okay, I look at him as if he was a bastard. I judge him to be a bastard. And to realise that that's something I'm projecting onto him. It's an opinion that I hold about him. It could be true, it could be false, it could be helpful, it could be unhelpful, rather than just seeing it that way as if it's an objective fact. Obviously that has to be addressed at the beginning of therapy if we're going to question things and evaluate them. So at the beginning, this was a kind of necessary precursor of what we call cognitive disputation. And then there were a number of researchers about 20 years ago or so who said, well, we think this part is quite powerful. What happens if we just do it on its own? So they developed more techniques to aid in distancing, and they developed an approach initially that was called comprehensive distancing. So just really rigorously helping the clients to gain this distance without even bothering to evaluate the evidence for and against the beliefs. And they found that was effective, and that evolved into a form of behaviour therapy, which is very popular now. It's called acceptance and commitment therapy. And they changed the terminology slightly. They call what cognitive therapists call cognitive distancing, they refer to as verbal diffusion, which kind of helps grammatically because it means you can also talk about thoughts or words being fused with reality, which kind of helps to clarify things a little bit. So I'm going to give an overview of some ideas related to this. First of all, basically what we're talking about, as I mentioned, is separating our thoughts or beliefs from reality, so they're not just blended or fused together. And the way that that's traditionally explained at the beginning of cognitive therapy is with an analogy. So cognitive therapists will say to clients, imagine you've got a pair of rose-tinted spectacles on, and you're looking through those. You don't see the spectacles, especially after a while you just get used to them. You just see a rose-tinted world, and you could be forgiven for thinking the world is just objectively rose-tinted. That's just the way it looks, until you take the glasses off and look at them, and now you're looking at the glasses rather than looking through them. In the same way, I might think someone's an idiot or a shithead or whatever. When I see them that way, it's like I'm looking at them through idiot tinted glasses. But I can also look at the glasses, and I can take a step back and look at the fact that I hold that opinion, I hold that judgment about the other person. I'm saying those things about them. So it's learning to kind of treat our own thoughts as objects, as it were, almost as if we're looking at someone else's thoughts or judgments. The analogy I like to give personally is the following one. Imagine you're sitting around a campfire in the woods and someone's telling you a ghost story, like a really scary story. And you're listening to this story about vampires and werewolves and ghosts or whatever, and it's really scary, so you start to get nervous and you turn pale, and you experience anxiety or fear because you're so engrossed in the story and you lose track of time and stuff. And you can imagine that experience of becoming lost in the story, even though it's completely fictional, and your heart rate actually going up, even though it's all made up, right? It's just a story. So we have emotional reactions to stories that we become engrossed in, but we have to kind of become engrossed in them to have the emotional reaction. If the person telling the story had a lisp or something, or a funny accent like me, or there was something else distracting about the way that they were telling it, they were doing it really slowly, we might still hear the words but be more focused on the way they're saying it rather than the ideas, than the story itself. So there's a difference between listening to the content of the story and listening to the storytelling. Although in both cases we're listening to the same thing, we're listening differently. And you could ruin a good story by becoming too focused on the storytelling itself, on the voice of the person that's telling it, and so on. So that's a way of defusing the story from reality, seeing it as a process or an activity rather than becoming lost in the meaning of the words. That could be annoying if you're trying to enjoy a good story, but it could be helpful if you're trying to interrupt a process of worrying or angry or depressive rumination, for example. The way the Stoics do this is by repeatedly telling themselves it's not things that upset us, but our judgments about things. That quote was taken verbatim from Epictetus, and in Albert Ellis's Rational Emotive Behaviour Therapy in particular, it was given on a piece of paper or taught to clients in the first therapy session as part of the socialisation process of therapy. And a lot of cognitive therapists traditionally teach that quote from Epictetus to their clients because it helps them achieve cognitive distancing. It's not things that upset us, but our judgments about things. And Marcus says something very similar. Probably more than once in the Meditations, he paraphrases that particular remark from the Handbook of Epictetus. Epictetus also tells his students to say to disturbing thoughts, such as something bad's going to happen. He says, pause and say to it, you're just an impression and not at all the thing you claim to represent. Now, again, very literally, he's saying you're an impression, you're not the thing you claim to represent. This is like a famous saying of Korzybski, the map is not the terrain. Again, peeling off or separating the thought from the external reality that it claims to represent. But there's something else odd about that remark. So that remark in itself, you're just an impression, not at all the things you claim to represent. It's a cognitive distancing or diffusion strategy. But there's something else about it. It involves a rhetorical strategy called apostrophizing, where you're talking to something imaginary. And in this case, you're apostrophizing the impressions or your imagination. You're talking to your thoughts as if you were talking to another person. That same strategy is used a lot in modern third wave cognitive therapy. So when someone starts worrying, they might be taught to pause and say, oh, hello worries, you're back again, haven't seen you for ages. Same old worries, back again, good to see you again. Because talking to the thoughts, although it sounds crazy, gives you a way of treating them as if they're objects, as if you're looking at the spectacles rather than looking through them. It's just a mind trick, if you like. Another way of doing that, it's kind of a little bit similar, is imagine that you're thinking something bad is going to happen and I won't be able to cope. Think of the difference between saying something bad is going to happen and saying, right now I notice I'm having the thought something bad is going to happen. As if you're putting your thought in quotation marks and just spelling out the fact, stating, I am having the thought, everyone is going to die. So there's a difference between thinking everyone is going to die and thinking, I notice right now the thought is going through my mind, everyone is going to die. Prefacing it in that way allows us again to gain cognitive distancing, as if we're putting it in a speech bubble or putting quotation marks around it and viewing it in this slightly odd perspective. There's a knack to doing that. Similarly, just literally writing down on a piece of paper, such as a thought record. Beck thought one of the main strategies for gaining cognitive distance was just doing your self-monitoring in cognitive therapy and writing down your thoughts on a piece of paper and pausing and just looking at them on the paper. Or in the therapy session, the therapist would write the client's thoughts on a whiteboard and have them there during the session so that they can look at them written on the board. And again, that's a good way of doing it. Another approach is to kind of use a metaphor and imagine you're like a scientist observing your own thoughts as if you were observing someone else's thoughts with an attitude of scientific objectivity, or like an anthropologist studying an exotic tribe and just kind of documenting the patterns of behaviour and thinking. So viewing yourself with that same sort of slightly odd, detached, objective kind of feeling or attitude. I think even asking yourself questions sometimes, like in therapy we often ask clients, how's that working out for you? Sneakily, that's a way of doing something called a functional analysis, where we get people to weigh up the pros and cons of a pattern of behaviour. We often do that more systematically, but very informally it works really well just to say to people, how's that working out for you? Just encouraging people to think about the consequences of doing something. Having people think about the consequences of holding a belief often kind of nudges them into looking at the belief from a defused perspective, as if they were kind of taking a step back and looking at their own behaviour in the way that they might look at someone else's. So we don't normally think what are the pros and cons of believing that revenge is justified or something like that. We don't normally evaluate our own assumptions in that way, and when we do, it often encourages us to take a step back and look at them in a detached way. There's another technique that's very popular in ACT, because there's some research that shows very consistently that it works well, and that's to condense a worry or another problematic or emotional thought into a short sentence and repeat it aloud very, very rapidly. Everyone in this room is going to die, 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 over and over and over again for like about a minute or so. And it's long been observed by psychologists that when we do that, the words start to kind of feel meaningless. And doing that again can help us gain cognitive distance. Like, it allows us to view the words like with a degree of detachment. Also, repeating them more slowly with pauses in between can be a way of doing it. Doing the worry time exercise we talked about before and just kind of thinking about something deliberately can often force us to gain distance, or in an unusual environment can make us more self-conscious, more detached from what we're saying. Observing different cues at the same time. So normally when we worry about stuff, we lose track of our environment and just become absorbed in the thoughts. But if you sit and deliberately think about something while observing your facial expression, or relaxing your body, or just practicing mindfulness of your breathing or body, then you're kind of having to walk and chew gum at the same time. Like, you're doing two things which now intrude on your awareness, whereas previously you were only absorbed in one thing, and that will tend to make the words less emotive, less fused with reality, and make you more detached from them. To really fuse with thoughts, especially thoughts about the future, something bad is going to happen, or about the distant past, you kind of need to forget about the present. So stuff that brings you back to the present, like observing your breathing and observing the tension or relaxation through your body while you have those thoughts, will tend to drag you out of fusion. And that means that even though you're having the thoughts, you're learning to have them in a detached way. There's a whole bunch of other exercises that I could mention. One is the ACT Leaves in the Stream exercise. I'm not sure if I've mentioned that already, but that involves just visualizing a stream with leaves floating gently away on it, and then when a thought pops into our mind, we imagine it's written on a piece of paper, just like writing it on the whiteboard or the thought record, put it on the leaf, look at it literally from a distance in our imagination, and then just allow it to let go of it basically and let it float downstream in its own time. So I wanted to kind of give a bunch of examples just to help clarify what cognitive distancing really is. But we usually come back to that initial socialization experiment that says, thinking someone's a shithead, like, and viewing it as if that's just an objective fact, is kind of like looking at the world through rose-tinted glasses and believing that the world just actually is rose-tinted. Whereas cognitive distance is when we take the glasses off and look at them, or when we pause and notice that we are telling ourselves the other person is a shithead, or we're holding that belief about them and viewing them from that perspective. So hopefully that helps to clarify what's meant by cognitive distancing. We're going to be talking more about that in week 2 in relation to worry and anxiety, which I'm going to briefly preview before we close today. I'll just check in for a sec before I do it, some of the comments that you're posting. Okay, cool. A couple of questions for me. Okay, I'll try and leave a little bit more time to come back to those questions at the end. We've got about 20 minutes left or so I'm just going to skim over, let's say 10 minutes or so in the preview of week 2. So week 2 is about stoic indifference. It's about conquering worry and anxiety, as I've mentioned. The part of Marcus's life it's about is, we looked at his education and his earlier life, which actually is quite a long period of time. It's the longest part of his life. It's right up to his acclamation as emperor, when he was, how old was he? He was 40-ish, 39, 40. So we kind of know a lot more about what happened afterwards. There's sometimes that creates the illusion that his reign as emperor was longer than it actually was. But he spent more of his life serving under Antoninus actually than he did being emperor himself. So now we're moving on to the early part of his reign, though. It's a period of about 5 years or so, from his acclamation to the end of the Parthian War. And roughly coincides with his joint rule with Lucius Verus, which ends when Lucius Verus drops dead. And what characterises this part of his life is that, having gone from this incredibly peaceful period under this incredibly calm and wise emperor, Antoninus Pius, as soon as Marcus and Lucius are acclaimed co-emperors, everything goes crazy. There's one disaster after another, not because of them, partly because of the transition of power, and partly just incredible bad luck. So many historians have said it kind of looks like, almost like the gods went, the Stoic emperor guy, let's test his stoicism out. So what we're going to hit him with, we're going to flood the Tiber. So lots of homes are destroyed, farm animals die, there's going to be a famine, there'll be a malaria epidemic, we'll have rebellions in Britain, on the northern frontier in Upper Germany. We'll have let's have the Parthians invade Armenia and trigger a huge war in the east. So these things just happen one after another. It may be that the Parthian king invaded because he'd been planning it for a long time and he thought this is the time to do it. We don't really know exactly what the chronology of these events is, so it may be that he thought Marcus was having other domestic problems, and then there were these kind of natural disasters. There was also a huge earthquake in another part of the empire that kind of almost destroyed a major city. And it could be the Parthian king thought, excellent, he's having all these problems, it's the perfect time to attack. Or it may also have been because of the transition in power. He thought Rome was weak, Marcus was in a weak position as a new emperor. Whatever the reason, Vologases IV invaded Armenia. It was an important Roman ally, a client state. He then, another kind of stroke of bad luck was that the governor of Cappadocia attacked him prematurely, and his legion, I think, were surrounded by the Parthians and just shot down with arrows. And so the Romans lost an entire legion at the start of the war, which was pretty bad for them. So it was a period of just disaster, basically one thing after another, and enormous stress and worry, and Marcus trying to find his feet at the same time. So that's kind of like what we're looking at in this section. The video for week 2 involves some recap of the self-monitoring strategies from week 1, so kind of building on that and adapting it, applying it to worry and anxiety. But it also talks about a technique called mental review, which comes from one of the earliest cognitive therapists, a guy called Victor Remy, and it was used by Aaron Beck as well in the original cognitive therapy manual for anxiety disorders. And from my experience as a therapist and a trainer, like, it's a fairly good way of approaching things. It's very simple. So it basically involves picturing an upsetting event and then visualizing it as if it was a movie clip, but doing that repeatedly for like 5, 10, 15 minutes, basically longer than you would normally, until you get bored with it. The feeling of getting bored with something that's upsetting is therapeutic in itself. It's strange that people would often stop when they start to feel bored, because if you persevere so that you get really bored with it, then you're not going to be anxious about it anymore. It's gone from being anxiety provoking to being merely boring. People have long observed this phenomenon, which is sometimes referred to as emotional habituation, and it's one of the most robustly established findings in the whole field of psychotherapy research. However, with the Ramey's approach, where it's kind of very repetitive, there are a bunch of other things that happen, and I'll talk about those in the video. Research early on in cognitive behavioural therapy showed that when you get people to repeatedly visualise upsetting or problematic situations, that often there's a lot of spontaneous change that goes on, and it falls into a whole bunch of different categories. Like, there's a bunch of different processes that may or may not kick in. For example, problem solving. So people maybe just picture something that's upsetting, they might figure out a better way of dealing with it. Or they might picture themselves responding differently over and over again, say acting assertively, and each time they visualise it, they might imagine themselves becoming more skillful at being assertive. So they may mentally rehearse and improve a skill, or figure out a different skill that would be applicable. Or the anxiety or other feelings might just wear off over time. They may be relaxed because they've closed their eyes and they're in a different environment, so they may, through repetition, learn to associate relaxation with the upsetting event, which will have a dampening effect on anxiety. It's called counter conditioning. And or they may just reality test or decatastrophize things spontaneously, so they might be worrying about something happening, and then through reviewing it repeatedly, they might just come to the conclusion it's not likely to happen, or that there's some false assumption that they've been making about it, and that may, like, change in their perspective on it. There's a whole bunch of things that can happen, fundamentally different sorts of changes that can happen when you leave it open like that, basically. And one of them also is cognitive distancing. When you repeatedly review a situation and observe yourself responding to it, you'll often gradually gain more and more distance from the thoughts that you're having in response to it. And then I follow that in the video by talking about a whole kind of repertoire of perspective shifting questions which are based on stoicism. So asking yourself, how would you advise another person to cope with this situation? How might someone wise who cares about you advise you to cope with it? What would an ideal sage do in this situation? What would you do if you were coping with greater wisdom? What would you do if you're coping with greater self-discipline? So these are all what I would describe as perspective shifting or cognitive restructuring questions. And again, what the research shows about anxiety in particular is that when we can entertain multiple perspectives on a problem, it tends to dilute or water down our anxiety. So there's a lot of research that shows that when people become anxious, their thinking becomes very narrowed down and rigid, and generating alternative perspectives is a well-known strategy in cognitive therapy that It creates a flexible perspective on things that's antagonistic to anxiety. In Stoicism, we can do that by asking what virtues do we have that would help with this situation, or how would a sage cope with this situation. Those are the sort of questions that the Stoics typically ask themselves. The excerpt for week 2 is about how Marcus prepares for the day ahead, and he talks about getting out of bed, which is curious, his morning routine. He talks about focusing on his duty to fulfill his nature. He talks about how the Pythagoreans contemplate the stars in the morning. And he talks about the premeditation of adversity, which is one of the main strategies that Stoics use to overcome anticipatory anxiety or worry. And I threw in a quote from Seneca as well, which is kind of interesting. It shows that he's describing something very similar to Marcus, which suggests that they might both once again be drawing on a common earlier source. Marcus talks a lot about preparing to deal with disloyalty and betrayal. His life was completely, a distrustful person after another, or one disloyal person after another. He had a civil war to deal with. Almost any conflict he dealt with was because a peace treaty had been broken and people had been conspiring and preparing to do that. So his whole reign was about dealing with a bunch of liars and people trying to catch him off guard and stuff. And as soon as he gets into the northern frontier and dealing with these numerous tribes, it's just constant frustration for him, and it becomes incredibly complex, playing one tribe off against another, and we can see them repeatedly forming treaties and then breaking them again. There's a lot of deception goes on. So when he talks about dealing with betrayal and disloyalty and deception, those are things that he was absolutely surrounded by, and they were life or death matters for him and for the empire. The stories that we talk about in week 2 are about Marcus, Lucius, the two co-emperors, and how their ways of coping with stress are in contrast. So in short, Lucius just got drunk and gambled, according to many reports. There's some discrepancy in the histories about how good or bad an emperor he was, but he didn't really take command during the Parthian War. He delegated that, it seems, to his main generals, and he spent a lot of time just kind of partying and stuff. He talks about how anxious he was negotiating peace with the Parthians and worried that everything would end in disaster, and then he just goes off with a bunch of his friends. He had a troupe of actors that he went around with, and he got drunk and hung out in the notorious resorts of the East, which were full of brothels. And there's all sorts of weird stories about the stuff that Lucius got up to. He was obsessed with sports and gambling as well. He's very, very different from Marcus. But we can see him in a way as coping with stress through avoidance. Whereas Marcus initially craves these villas on the seashore and in the countryside as a getaway from the stress. But we see in the letters to Fronto that he's very conflicted about this because he feels that he needs to be working even when he's there. And later in the Meditations, he says all this really interesting stuff about how even though he has a kind of craving to go to these places and get away from all the chaos of war, he feels he can recapture the peace of green fields or mountaintop retreats within himself wherever he is. And he has a stoic way of coping with things. How does he do that? Through cognitive distancing, basically. So that's something that we're going to be looking at in a little bit more detail. And also through living in the present moment. So we'll look at excerpts from the Meditations that describe how he achieved this. And it's through doing things like living in the present moment, gaining cognitive distance, and also reminding himself that the things he faces are similar to things that have been and gone before, and they're all transient and temporary. And also by abandoning rhetoric and describing things using what the Stoics call an objective representation, so just sticking to the facts and removing any emotional language from the way that he describes the situation. There's also a short section about the reserve clause, and this is important because people think of the Stoics sometimes as being overly accepting or passive, but they were generally men of action. So we'll talk about how the Stoics reconcile emotional acceptance with virtuous action. And the audio recording is about repeated review. We've kind of touched on that already. The main discussion for week 2 is about how Stoicism can help with worry and anxiety. So think about, CBT is heavily influenced by Stoicism and has been proven hugely effective in treating worry and anxiety. So, we kind of know that some aspects of Stoicism are very relevant to this. But from the literature, from Marcus, what do you think might be helpful in your own life? And then there's a couple of bits of bonus material that I've thrown in that were like things that are available already on the net or my blog, but might be relevant to you. One is an article about Marcus at the amphitheatre, which kind of relates to this earlier part of his life and how he just hated going to these spectacles and watching the gladiatorial matches and chariot races and stuff. And he wanted to work at those times, but he was kind of forced because it upset the population if he didn't go to these things. And what he does is turn them into Stoic meditations. He treats the things he's observing as metaphors for Stoic philosophy and for life. So it's very interesting to see how he does that. And also there's a podcast where I spoke about anxiety and OCD in relation to Stoicism, which I thought might be relevant for week 2. So we've got just a few minutes remaining. It is time for me to pop out the chat window and just very briefly have a look at questions that might be in there. Okay, let's see, there's not loads, so I'm going to go through them in reverse order actually. So Greg asked me, so for counter conditioning, is it recommended to relax while visualizing or to be mindful of the upset and let it naturally habituate? I'm going to give a very abbreviated answer to that because it's a kind of moot point in a way. Almost all, like most modern therapists now, don't use relaxation, and they'll recommend just being mindful and allowing the feelings to habituate naturally. I'm one of the few people that would say there's sometimes a role. Counter conditioning was the original behaviour therapy technique developed in the late 1950s by Joseph Volpa. It was pretty much the first major form of behaviour therapy. The therapy based on it was called systematic desensitisation. And the reason I'm kind of reluctant to completely let that go is that in my experience, many people find it easier. There's some problems with using relaxation because some people use it avoidantly, and that's why cognitive therapists today don't tend to recommend it. But that's mainly for more severe diagnosable mental health problems, whereas what the research indicates is that it's still an effective technique for subclinical problems. So like ordinary worry and anxiety, relaxation can be a perfectly effective way of coping. You just have to be careful that you're not using it because you're really intolerant of the feelings of anxiety or you're kind of trying to block or suppress them. But even some of the third wave therapists, this is where it gets really slippery. They believe that there are ways of using relaxation where it's not viewed as a form of avoidance and it can contribute to mindfulness. So it's a bit of a thorny issue, but the short answer is that I think for mild or moderate feelings of anxiety, as long as you're not really using it to try and block or avoid feelings too much, relaxation can be a more comfortable, easier solution for many people. But for most severe anxiety, most modern therapists will recommend mindfulness or just acceptance of the feelings. Greg again, what about fusion with thoughts that are neutral or even pleasant? That's fine. It's not something you'd normally try to reverse. Should one work with those? I find out pleasant conversations in my head that lead to procrastination or wandering on the internet. Oh yeah, well, I mean, it doesn't matter whether they're pleasant or unpleasant. It's more whether they're problematic or not. So yeah, like if you had pleasant thoughts that I guess in therapy might, for example, be a problem with addiction. So you're thinking, gosh, but cigarettes are really good. I really love, I really just enjoy smoking. You might want to defuse from those thoughts in order to prevent addictive behaviour, for example, or compulsively using the internet. just treat them exactly the same way. It doesn't matter whether they're pleasant or unpleasant. It's more to do with functional analysis actually. How's it working out for you? If these pleasant thoughts aren't working out very well for you in the long term, if they're causing other problems in your life, then yeah, you can totally use diffusion on them. Another question. Oh, hang on. Greg Stott. Donald, cognitive distancing happens when we deliberately step back mentally from watching a movie that we're immersed in and see it as a movie rather than emotionally engrossed in it. Yeah. So that's not a question. That's just repeating something I said, I think. Greg Lopez, again, lots of exercise to choose from. How would you recommend clients choose one, and how long to work with one or another? Maybe this is a bit of a bland answer, but in reality, if you're choosing a technique, you'd consider, does it resemble a skill the client already has? So basically, how easy is it going to be for them to learn this? Which one do they prefer using? And which is going to be the quickest thing to teach them? Some techniques take longer to train people in than others. So, basically that's what you'd think about. I've just hit you with a battery of examples. I guess if we're approaching it from a Stoic perspective, we might prefer to choose ones just for the sake of the course that are more Stoic, like saying you are just an impression and not at all the thing you claim to represent, for instance, or reminding yourself it's not things that upset us but our judgments about them. But every therapist will also have some preference as well. The leaves in the stream exercise I quite like doing. There's also another technique that I haven't mentioned. I used to do a lot of metacognitive therapy, and there's a different approach that was developed in the UK that I used to use quite a lot with clients. So there are other ways of doing it. But I'd say a consideration is building on existing skills. So if somebody does mindfulness meditation, for instance, which is pretty common these days, you might talk to them about that and whether you can get them to use a modified version of that, for instance. Other than that, it's just whatever seems most practical, most expedient, basically. The techniques, as long as they work for the client, that's the main thing. I was going to say they're all much of a muchness, but some of them, there is reason to believe that some of them are generally more effective than others. So they haven't all been tested independently, but the one where you repeat a phrase over and over again has. So I have a preference for that, and some therapists have a preference for that, simply on the basis that there's robust evidence supporting it. David Morgan, Donald, what combination of exercises do you recommend for situations in which the anger anxiety producing event is likely to continue to develop over a period of days? To develop over a period of days, probably use more or less the same approach. Also, are there exercises that can help bring on the virtues? The only thing I'd say about that is if it's a situation that you can anticipate or it's recurring, then I'd focus on the worst part of it normally, unless that's overwhelming, in which case I'd focus on another part of it that's particularly upsetting. Assuming it's not kind of pathological and an overwhelming problem, then normally I'd pick the most anxiety provoking aspect or part of it and focus on that. For instance, if you're using some kind of visualization technique like the sort of mental review that's in the audio recording we're doing. Also, other exercises that can help bring on the virtues in anger, anxiety producing situations rather than just neutralize problematic feelings and emotions. Yeah, that kind of takes us a little bit into another area, so I'm only going to respond to that more briefly, but the shortest answer to that would be like some kind of mental rehearsal exercise where you visualize yourself exhibiting one of the virtues, or a modelling exercise where you picture someone else doing it and then imagine yourself imitating them, like the Contemplation of the Sage audio that we have in week 1. Or another technique would be to create a cue or a trigger. Like I used to press the base of my thumbnail when I was like really intensely visualizing something or evoking a feeling, and then in a situation, in order to get back into that mental state, I'd make the same signal to myself or use a cue word or something. So in therapy, we train people to enter into a state or an attitude, and to do that repeatedly in a safe environment, and then maybe associate with a brief cue or trigger that they can do in vivo in the face of a difficult or a complex situation. So hopefully that helps answer the question a little bit. It's a little bit hard sometimes to comment on situations without knowing, more information about them. So maybe I'm missing the point of the question there, but hopefully that's of some help. I think those are all of the questions, and that's an hour and 5 minutes. So thanks everybody once again for tuning in, and hopefully you got some hints and tips from that. And good luck with week 2. As always, if you've got any other questions, feel free just to get in touch and let me know. Otherwise, it is goodbye from me once again in Nova Scotia, and goodbye from Mookie Dog, who is snoozing peacefully over there in the corner. Bye.